Hi, my name is JonSlattery, and today I'm going to talk to you about characteristics of surfing athletes. During my talk today, I'll give you a brief history about surfing, how it started, and how it progressed, and then also the characteristics of the surfing athletes themselves, such as age, body mass, stature, etc. And then the physiological values of these athletes, such as VO2, and then I would also do training guidelines from the results of the studies. So surfing was originally known as the sport of Hawaiian kings. So these kings were the only ones that were allowed to basically, as they describe it, glide upon the waves. And modern day surfing, how it gained popularity is mainly due to the Hawaiian Duke, and I'll probably butcher this name, Kahanamoku. And he traveled all over Europe, Australia, and the US doing surfing and swimming demonstrations, and this is what really brought to light what surfing was to these countries. And now in these countries, that's where surfing is most popular. And the first world championship was held in Australia in 1964. So now with the growing popularity, there are a lot of governing bodies, and I have some listed up here. And you have the Association of Surfing Professionals. That has actually been the one to kind of become the leading governing body for professional surfing. And they organize what's called the competitive calendar, or the World Championship Tour. And I also have listed on here the ISA, and then each country kind of has their own surfing association. And then surfing industry companies have actually become pretty big for the governing bodies. So a little bit about the WCT, or World Championship Tour. It first began in 1976, and with this, the top 44 surfers worldwide compete in this. And basically what happens is, after the competitive season, they rank each one, and then for the next competitive season, the last 16 place WCT surfers automatically lose their spot, and there's a feeder system to the WCT called the World Qualifying Series, or WQS. And the top 16 athletes from the WQS replace those 16 that lost their spot in the WCT. So a little bit more about the competitive calendar. It's almost kind of like NASCAR, where they have a ton of different trials, and then they're given a certain amount of points for their ranking at each event. And then at the end of the calendar, they're totaled, and that's how they get their final position in the tour. So at each event, there's competition heats, and these are elimination-based heats, and typically last between 20 to 40 minutes, and has about 2 to 4 surfers per heat. How each heat is scored is, for that 20-40 minutes, each surfer is pretty much trying to catch the best wave possible, and there's no limit to the amount of waves that they can catch, because scoring goes off the 2 best waves of each surfer for that heat, and those scores from each 2 each of the waves is combined to give the surfer their score for that heat. And whatever surfer comes out with the top score for that heat goes on to the next round until finally reaching the finals for that event. And little statistic here that I found is the average distance a surfer will cover per heat is about 1,600 meters, which is almost about a mile. And that's per heat. And for a competition, they'll go through many heats, probably around 15, until they reach the finals. So some of the judging criteria for surfing events is basically to score the most amount of points, a surfer must be able to do really difficult maneuvers on waves, and the better the wave, the better the score is most likely going to be, because you're going to be able to perform more maneuvers, and they'll also give more points for innovative or progressive maneuvers, so ones that aren't typically seen at an event. And then, so basically executing all the criteria with a high level of difficulty and with a good amount of control is going to give the surfer the best amount of points. So a little about the surfing process. The surfer first goes out on the ocean and he paddles off to what's known as the takeoff area. And that's pretty much where you'll see a surfer kind of stationary for a while. And he's waiting to catch a wave that he thinks is going to be nice or whatever. And so once he decides on a wave to take, powerful strokes are going to be needed to be gathered up by that wave. Is if he just stands there, he's just going to float right over that wave. So he has to pretty much catch up to the speed of that wave. And then once the wave is caught, a surfer has to quickly prop up onto his or her feet, and then not only balance, but try to perform maneuvers to impress judges. So the movements for surfing are typically classified as arm paddling, stationary, wave riding, and miscellaneous. And what miscellaneous typically is your maneuvers. There's something called duck diving, where they're diving under waves that they don't want to take, mainly while they're paddling out to the takeoff area. And Mayer et al. Determined the time spent during each movement during 1 hour of recreational surfing, and determined that arm paddling had the greatest amount of time spent with about 44%, and then stationary was the second highest with 35%, and then they combined wave riding and miscellaneous at 21%. Another study that did a time analysis did it during competitive surfing and found that arm paddling took up a little bit more of the total time with 51% of the time. And then stationary still was the second highest with 42%. And then they split wave riding and miscellaneous and found that those values were actually smaller, with wave riding at 3.8% and then miscellaneous at 2.5%. So there were a little bit more differences between recreational and competitive surfing, and there are a few factors that might play into effect with that, such as the environmental conditions, such as the swell size, consistent surf currents, and wavelength or frequency. And then also during competitive surfing, you have the tactical decisions, such as if they know a opposing surfer's score is higher than theirs, they might take a wave they usually don't to score higher points, or they decide not to take a wave because they do have higher points. So I have a graph here from a study by Farley, where he also looked at different events during a competition and still found that paddling still held the most significant percentage of the total time. Then you also had the stationary, and then paddling for the wave to catch it. This was one of the few studies that actually looked at that, and as you can see, it kind of mimics the wave riding and miscellaneous, all three at kind of low percentages, all under 10. So a little bit about surfing practice. And when you talk to most surfers, they do not look at recreational surfing as practice. To them, it's fun, and they're not really training. They're just out there doing what they like. And that's part of the reason why there haven't been much studies that have looked at the physiological values of surfing athletes, or even thought about different training guidelines for these athletes. So typically, surfing practice can last between 20 minutes to 5 hours, and the different environmental factors that affect the wave size and etc. are likely to have an underlying impact on the physiological demands of surfing. And also, with surfing, it does require a lot of mental and cognitive ability. And then it also does consist of long periods of high intensity intermittent exercise. So one study looked at how much recreational surfers, those that aren't ranked or doing the competitive season, how much they practice, and they found that about 4 hours a day for 3 days a week was the average. And then they also looked at competitive surfers, and they found that about 3.7 hours a day, but for 5 days per week. So even though we kind of had a smaller number for the number of hours per day, not by much, only by 0.3, they did have 2 more days more during the week for practice. Okay, so a little bit about characteristics of the surfers. So in 2003, the top 44 WCT surfers averaged about 27 and a half years old, and the oldest was only 36 years old. Now this is slightly getting older compared to when they looked at it in 1978, where the average age was 22.2 years old, and I think the oldest for that was 29 years old. So they are getting a little bit older, but that could be just due to the popularity and the fact that you do have professional surfers now who can make a career out of it. Back then they didn't. And then, so a little bit about the stature. Surfers tend to be shorter than, even compared to age-matched water athletes, such as water polo players, where surfers had a range between 161 to 188 centimeters compared to 186.5 centimeters for water polo players. So with the shorter stature, this actually might be an advantage for them, since it does lower their center of gravity, which helps with balance so they can perform maneuvers easier. And then another study looked at body mass of 76 surfers, and the average was 67.9 kilograms, compared to both elite swimmers and water polo players who had 78.4 kilogram and 86.1 kilogram body mass. So surfers tend to be also lighter than their sport match subjects. And then, though that shorter and lighter would be an advantage, studies have shown that as far as body composition, there is no advantage with that, at least none to be found. But surfers do typically have a higher percent body fat than their compared to other water endurance athletes. And the study that also looked at the body mass of the surfers also found that they average about 10.5% body fat, which is still lower than your average untrained subject, but it was higher than other endurance athletes. And some authors have come to hypothesize that moderate levels of body fat may be advantageous due to the fact that it could provide protection from the environments. A lot of surfing environments are cold, gets obviously wet and pretty windy. So another study looked at somatotyping. So this is a technique to evaluate human body morphology or body shape. And you have three different categories. You have endomorphy, mesomorphy, ectomorphy. Endomorphy is going to be more of your kind of fatness. Mesomorphy is muscular, and ectomorphy is kind of linear for both of those, so it's kind of a combination. And the study that evaluated the somatotype of these surfers found that they were pretty much scattered all over the place. So, but they did have quite a few in the mesomorphy, but still in the other categories, it still had a pretty high number. And this figure kind of shows it. They looked at the different levels of surfers. So your black shaded dots are your competitive athletes, and then the white dots are just your recreational. So as you can see, I mean, they don't really fall into the endomorphy very much, but they do kind of go towards the ectomorphy and mesomorphy, but they're still really scattered. So aerobic fitness seems to be pretty key with surfing due to the long periods of high intensity intermittent exercise. And one study found that peak oxygen uptake, or VO2 peak, found that the values for 6 recreational surfers was about 54.2. And then another study looked at competitive surfers and found that it was 50 and 47. So there wasn't really much of a difference between recreational and competitive, but they are also pretty similar to other upper body athletes. But when you look at the absolute values, surfers are actually higher than other upper body athletes. And studies showed that surfers had a VO2 peak of 46.83, while elite swimmers only had a VO2 peak of 38.66. So they also looked at VO2 peak for surfers doing lower body exercise, and there has been many studies that show that changing the body position for a VO2 test will change the values, where upper body VO2 tests will only represent up to 70-75% of the lower body VO2 test. But even with this, they were still curious to see how they would rank up against other land endurance athletes, where they found that surfers during a lower body exercise VO2 test, they had levels of 70.2 and 62.2. And these are lower than your endurance trained athletes, but they are still higher than your untrained subjects. This is a picture where you can see this is how they test surfers. They have them in the prone position, and right here they have a surfboard, and it basically mimics as much as possible surfing off water. And they don't have it too well in here, but right here they have like a hand paddle, so that way the surfer has a cupping hand that they would typically use when they are paddling out. So, then lactate threshold, which is a very informative measurement of endurance performance, was also assessed, and Mendez Villanueva found that significantly higher LT levels were found in surfers that had a higher competitive ability than those that didn't. And it also, LT correlated significantly with the final rankings in the WCT. And this could be due because a high LT would allow for longer periods of time at high intensity, which could also allow the surfer to be able to not be fatigued when taking a wave, and then to be able to catch whatever wave they want to. So this is just a scatter plot done by the study to kind of show you have the season ranking down here, and they only did 13 athletes, and it's not specified to whether your first place for the study was actually first place in the WCT. It's just their subjects, and they looked at who ranked higher than who. And then you have lactate threshold percentage over here, and as you can see, the line of best fit, as you go down in ranking, your LT goes down, but you do have significant difference. That could also be due to the basically uncontrollable factors of the surfing environment, which underlie impact the surfer's ability. So, I mean, you can see on here, the guy who ranked 5th in this study actually had one of the highest LT thresholds, but you also did have to where your subjects with the lowest also ranked in the lowest for the season. So peak aerobic power has also been found to be highly correlated with the ending season ranking, where they actually found that the higher the rank, they actually have a 25% greater peak aerobic power than lower level surfers. And this is another scatter plot that kind of shows that. And you still have the kind of variability where even the guy who had the highest peak aerobic power didn't rank in the top. He did rank in the top 5, but didn't place first. And but you can still see that the lower the peak aerobic power for each subject was, the lower their ending season ranking was. So another crucial aspect to surfing is reaction time, where this is the ability to deal with the highly unstable and changing environment. And this was also found to significantly correlate with the placement in each contest. And that was evaluated in the study that looked at the 76 professional surfers. And there's only been a few studies that have looked at heart rate on water. And one study looked at 1 hour of surfing for 6 recreational surfers, where they found that the average heart rate was 171 beats per minute, which is 95% of the peak value attained on the swim bench test. And then for the total time, they found the average was 135 beats per minute, which is 75% of the heart rate peak. And these values do meet ACSM's criteria for training intensity to develop cardio fitness. So how heart rate probably doesn't represent the movement patterns is due to the fact that you do have the intermittent nature of surfing and all of the external factors that can basically either decrease or increase the heart rate of the surfer. So this is just a simple bar graph that kind of shows the percentage that each surfer spent during that time, where you have different ranges, so 100, 1 to 100, 101 to 120, etc. You can see the 2 largest were between 121 and 140, and then 141 and 160. So from these, you can develop some training guidelines for surfers. Most importantly, on the water training is going to be the most important. Mainly because surfing is such a technical sport where you need the repetitions to develop each maneuver and to develop that technical proficiency. And also because in water training is really hard to simulate when you're out of the water. So, but additional off-water training can help improve a surfer's optimum level of fitness and also address any physiological weaknesses. But additional training intensity needs to be monitored really carefully, because you can't really determine the intensity for surfing practice before surfing practice due to the fact you don't know how the waves are going to be. So really needs to monitor the intensity, because you want to avoid the excess fatigue or the possibility of overtraining. And so upper body endurance and strengthening would help the arm paddling for surfers. And you could use the time motion analysis studies to kind of help give you guidelines for the workout load for exercise such as swim bench interval training. And also use the overload principle to gain the most from that training. So for upper body strength training, Shepard actually found that maximal pull-up strength was strongly correlated with sprint paddling performance. But with strength training off water, the muscle is essential for board propulsion or arm paddling don't really need to be part of it because of the high intensity that they're going through during surfing practice. So those muscles are shoulders, upper back, etc. And another aspect that should be trained off water is the balance and proprioception, which is crucial for performance. And this is required to be able to combine both power and control when you are riding those waves and trying to perform maneuvers. And to do this, different modes of cross training would be really beneficial, such as skating, snowboarding, pretty much anything that deals with a lot of balance. And also, another recommendation is plyometric exercises, primarily for the lower body, just to develop more power in those legs. So in conclusion, with the growing popularity of surfing, more studies should be done on the physiological adaptations of surfing, and there are no studies that look at the balance and proprioception levels of surfers. And even though it's pretty obvious that that is a crucial aspect, no studies have looked at that. And so future studies should also look at beginning level surfers, to where they haven't really reached that adaptation fully yet, just to see exactly what the adaptations physiologically and neuromuscularly are caused by surfing. And then, so from the results from the studies, surfers are at the same level as other water-based endurance athletes.